books that have been banned, a history of banning books, not necessarily only specific books, over the centuries, and then a number of events that happened in the United States over the course of our history. So, and the website is on that handout, so if you want to go read it in big print, you do that. And so, Annette and Todd, do you want to try?
Sure.
Shoulder it? And would you each introduce yourself, give just a little bit of your background, and then go forward. And then at the end, we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so for questions.
That's fine. What about the microphone?
It's on.
Does this work?
Yes, it does.
So, I'd like to cut immediately to what is most problematic in this legislation, presuming that you have a copy of it in hand, present.
Excuse me, would you say who you are?
Yes, of course. Apologies. I am R. Todd Bailey. I am an English teacher at Moscow High School. I've taught there since 2014. And it is only within the past 4 years that the potential for removing materials from our library has become a very serious concern. And so, this legislation is the product of about 4 years' work by very hardliners in the Idaho state legislature. And myself and other interested members of the district and high school have been fighting this year to year to year. The problem is that that is to say, the sponsors of this bill treat it much like a slot machine. And they keep pulling the lever over and over again until they find success. And that strategy is viable because as a public school teacher, you have very little time and progressively less energy to keep fighting the same legislation over and over and over again. This year, it passed with a sufficient majority in part because they relied on the exhaustion of those who may oppose it. That is something to bear in mind as interested citizens, and regardless of your profession or personal beliefs, when the opposing side essentially capitalizes on the fact that you have no time or energy left to spend, that is a good indication that they are in the moral wrong. In terms of the legislation itself, I think the word duplicity explains its intent and nature better than any other. This is to say that the authors of this 710 intend to create far greater consequences than the language of this bill might at first suggest. And that's why I make so much of what is unclear. I believe that the ambiguity is deliberately written into the bill so as to provide room for those who would like to use it as a lever for more radical agendas exactly to do so. So consider with me for just a second, when in the obscene materials definitions section begins, this is labeled 18-1514, and you're moving down to number 6, which is the definition of harmful to minors. What is most alarming to me is that there are phrases such as prurient interest of minors. This is in small case letter A. So the second criteria listed for harmful to minors in its definition. This is at the bottom of page 1. It's at line 38. Okay. It says it appeals, that is whatever is being considered potentially harmful, appeals to the prurient interest of minors as judged by the average person, applying contemporary community standards. And then we'll pass on to B here in just a second. But as I've asked others, I have no idea who that average person is. I would like to shake hands with the average person. Because that is actually code for anyone who happens to agree with the author of the bill. It does not attempt to capture the real opinions of librarians or parents, and least of all students. This average person is merely a fiction intended to cause this bill to masquerade as a kind of democratic legislation, something that is actually in the public welfare. It's nonsense. Further, when it says applying contemporary community standards, I have even less faith that we will be able to establish those community standards in a legal sense. And that is not to say that we do not share a basically common morality. The problem is that this legislation does not concern morality, it concerns aesthetics. And if we were to ask each other our opinions on theft, violence, murder, etc., we would all find immediate agreement. But if we were to start talking about our preferred forms of art, or our preferred forms of music, or literature, there would be almost no agreement. And that is the problem. There is no community standard upon which to judge whether something is aesthetically harmful to minors. But that is what the legislation demands. It goes on and repeats this basic logic using synonymous language. I find the constant recital of this series of sexual deviancy to be particularly funny, as it occurs over and over again in the legislation. I've actually passed out copies of this bill to students of mine in class to make sure that they understand what is happening and to give them an opportunity to write on their own behalf to their legislators, and quickly realized that the substance of the legislation, the language of it itself, violates its own terms. That is to say, I can't read it out loud without causing harm to somebody. So down here at number 6, letter B, it says, after the laundry list, which are patently offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community with respect to what is available material for minors and includes, etc., etc. You can anticipate my criticism. These prevailing standards are just as fictitious as the community standards. And yet this is the second time that they have been brought up, as though they are something concrete. Let's consider the couple of caveats. These would be Roman numerals I and double I. So 1 and 2, small case letters. This begins on line 4 of page 2 and continues on in the next section at line 6, and then goes on. What I find most interesting is the attempt to mollify people like myself who would prefer to preserve some literature, even though in one sense it might qualify as sexually explicit, whereas in another sense it is artistically or scientifically valuable. And so they go on and say, nothing herein contained is intended to include or prescribe any matter which, when considered as a whole and in context in which it is used, possesses serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. Again, I don't know how we establish what is serious literary value or artistic value. I'm not really sure in the state of Idaho that we can be confident what is of political value. I don't know what is scientific value per se, although I can guess with somewhat more certainty than I can the other terms. What I want to make very clear is that caveat is transparently worthless, because the inherent disagreement will make it impossible for someone to defend their choice to preserve a particular material in a court of law. You cannot simply stand up and say this possesses literary value. That's not compelling, and no aesthetic argument ever will be. So please read those sections beyond their superficial meanings, right? Their superficial meanings suggest something positive and reassuring, whereas immediately under that surface there is a kind of gaping ambiguity that merely makes room for anyone who would like to remove anything from a library or a classroom. There are other problems with this, and one of them was raised as I conversed with the superintendent in an English department meeting last week. It says on page 3, at line 37 and 38, how challenges to materials are supposed to happen. So earlier in the legislation, and I'll allow you to read this more at your leisure, it talks about who is allowed to collect their $250, having proven that the school was in the wrong, delivering materials to students which was harmful to them. Okay? But later on, it describes almost surreptitiously who is allowed, in fact, to bring a challenge in the first place. So the essential differences between who is allowed to bring the challenge and who is legally permitted to collect their $250. You can only collect if you are the parent, the guardian of a student, or the student him or herself. You can challenge without any real legal standing whatsoever. The language at line 37 and 38 on page 3 reads this way: each school and public library shall have a readily accessible form allowing a person to request review of material, etc. That's the challenge. Request review of the material. That's legal speak for challenging the book, which does result in its immediate removal. Not permanent, but there are 60 days under which the district is now obliged to judge whether or not it is harmful. We'll get to this in just a second. What I want to make obvious is, earlier in that same statement, it says, accessible form allowing a person to request review of material. A person. That's anyone. That's not a parent, or a guardian, or a student, or anyone even limited to those who have a direct relationship to the district. That is anyone. Which means with this legislation, Moscow High School, where I work, is now exposed to the whim of anyone in the United States who might choose remotely to log on to our library's website, do a search for a particular title. They're on a recliner somewhere in Florida, and now they can challenge. What's even worse about this is that 60 days, right? That means that on July 1st, a representative from Moms for Liberty or some related group can come to our superintendent with a list of books, like the famous 93. That person can come with 93 different forms filled out, and now suddenly slam it on our desk and say, deal with this. Now the problem is we have 60 days to address all of that. If the 60 days elapses and we have not come to a decision, those books are immediately deemed harmful and will be removed. So, it is possible for someone to bring challenges strategically and in volume so as to basically jam the system and make it impossible for us to defend ourselves. That's the nature of this legislation. I would like to include also some information regarding where bills like this come from. Because the common assumption is that these are actually written by legislators in Boise, or that they have some kind of local origin. Let's be very clear, Jaron Crane, who is a representative from District 12 in Nampa, is the mover behind House Bill 710. He is the first line sponsor. He is also a member of a group known as Parents for Liberty and Freedom, or maybe it's Parents for Freedom and Liberty. If you do just a little research, you will discover that Parents for Freedom and Liberty are affiliated with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And by affiliated, I mean their leadership knows each other. They invite people to their meetings. Basically, there is an overlap in terms of the membership of one organization and the membership of another. That can either be a formal overlap, or it can just be a mutual attendance at the other's meetings. It's basically that kind of relationship. And now, the Idaho Freedom Foundation is itself a member of the State Policy Network. The State Policy Network is itself the arm of the Heritage Foundation insofar as it attempts to coordinate policy on a state level across the nation, especially policies that they cannot get through in the federal government. So the path B, essentially, for people who are frustrated not getting it through Congress, is to seek out representation and passage of their legislation state by state by state by state. That's what the State Policy Network does, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation is basically the Idaho arm of that network. Okay, it's one of the hubs. The State Policy Network, being a member of the Heritage Foundation, is not itself innocent, because the Heritage Foundation is itself the think tank of the Council on National Policy. The Council on National Policy is an organization that scarcely anyone has ever heard of. I like to say that it's the organization filled with arch conservatives that you thought were dead. They're not. They just retired, and this is where they go. Okay? The Council for National Policy is no joke. They make the John Birch Society look like pansies. Okay? If you do just a little research, their mission in life is to make the United States a quote-unquote Christian nation. And by that, they don't mean Sunday schools and cheerfulness. You should be thinking more like Margaret Atwood. The Council on National Policy was established in the beginning of the 1970s. The kinds of culture wars that have been fought, especially by the Republican Party, are an outgrowth of the literature circulated by the Council on National Policy. They were among the first organizations really to capitalize on birth control issues, homosexual issues, basically the frontline items that you will see on any list of main cultural disagreements in the United States today. The CNP has had its hands in for the better part of 50 years. What is interesting is that you will never see the CNP's label on anything. In fact, most people wouldn't even be aware that the Idaho Freedom Foundation exists, much less that the Parents for Freedom and Liberty are somehow associated with the IFF. I guess in short, what's important to realize here is that these layers themselves are basically fictitious. What you're looking at is a series of arms and tendrils of the CNP. It's their literature, it's their philosophy that circulate right through the Heritage Foundation, the State Policy Network, the IFF, and so on. All of these are essentially feelers from one source. An analogy to make this even clearer, visit a coffee shop. and tell yourself that all of the espresso drinks are actually different from each other. They're not. They're all coffee. The same thing applies to this situation. You see the IFF, you see the Parents for Freedom for Liberty, you see the State Policy Network, and they all look different. They're not. No more than each of those drinks is not itself coffee. It's the same. So there are two ways to look at this legislation, and I'll conclude there. There's the substance of the writing itself, which is draconian and, in my opinion, a clear and present threat to a lot of basic institutions that we take for granted. There's also the source, which is fundamentally hostile to democracy itself. And if we mistake this for what it is, a truly silent revolution, we run a great risk. And by silent, I mean this exhaustion, which tends to incapacitate the opposition, the way the news is reported. I'll leave you with this. In this meeting with our superintendent last week, he confessed that lots of districts around us are quietly removing books from their libraries. And when he uses the word quieting, I find that particularly aggravating, because no one knows this, but those books are vanishing. And it's happening because smaller districts around us are filled with very conservative constituencies. And because of that, librarians and others associated with the district fear the lawsuits that are now permitted under this legislation. And so to avoid it, just to avoid it, to avoid the consequences, they're not even holding reviews. They're not even waiting for challenges. They're just taking the books out. And that's what I mean by silent revolution. It's when it happens without anybody noticing. So, forgive the slight disorganization of my thoughts. This has been an ongoing source of great frustration to me for about 4 years. I've researched this and tried to disseminate the information that I've discovered through a variety of fora, but so far, this is what we have. So, be alarmed.
Thank you so much. My name is Annette Pimentel. I've lived in Moscow for about 8 years. I'm the mother of 6 children, so I've had a lot of experience with minors. In my professional life, I write books by children, nonfiction books for children. But I'm here not as an author, but as an elected member of the Latah County Board of Trustees for the Public Library. And I wanted to start, I really appreciated Mr. Bailey's comments. I'm going to be talking about how this law affects public libraries, and he covered more of the school library side. So first of all, I wanted to share with you what we as a board feel like are the core values that our library operates on. And this is for all members of our community, whatever the age, whether they're tiny people or grown-up people. We believe first in free access to information, and that both means access without cost and also access without impediment. We want people to have access to information. Second, we believe that the patrons of our library should have privacy, that people don't have to worry about what someone else may think about them for wanting to learn about something. And third, we believe and we strive to make our collection represent our community as a whole. I come from a very particular Christian faith tradition, and the library has books from my Christian faith tradition. It has from other Christian faith traditions. It has from the Muslim tradition, from the Hindu tradition. So anyway, we're trying to represent all the people who are in our community. So this law provides legal challenges to all of those core values. On Friday, I was on a Zoom call that was sponsored by the Idaho Commission for Libraries. I was one of 94 participants. So not all of them were libraries. For example, there were 2 of us from Latah County Library, but it was about 60 or 70 public libraries in the state of Idaho. And I was pretty stunned at what I heard. Our library board, as every other library in the state of Idaho, has already contacted our attorney, and we've had our attorney review the law with us and tell us what he thinks it means. Well, on that meeting, I discovered, and we all discovered, that our lawyers, as they read this law, there are 60 or 70 different interpretations of what the law means. And as Idaho Commission for Libraries pointed out to us, they said that none of us knows what this law means until it goes to the court. So some library district is going to get sued, and that's when we're going to start to get some information about what it is and about what it will mean for our district. There are a few terms in this law that we as a library board are particularly concerned about. One is the issue of who can bring a suit, and Mr. Bailey brought that up. Our lawyer thinks that it has to be someone in Latah County. Other lawyers do not think that that is true. There are other issues that have to do with public libraries. For example, we're a member of a consortium of libraries, and if you've checked things out from our library, you know that you can get something from Lewiston, you could get something from Asotin in Washington. So are we now responsible for what they hold in their library? We don't know, and the law is silent on that. And if somebody, so another question is, what does it mean to obtain, for a minor to obtain an item? Our lawyer told us that he thinks it means that they check it out and take it out of the library. Well, other lawyers think that it means that they walk into the library and pull something off a shelf. It's totally unclear what it means. What about obtaining something electronically? One of the biggest increases in our checkouts is in electronic books. I don't know if you may have a Libby account, and what about kids looking at things on Libby? Are we responsible for that? The third thing is another phrase that Mr. Bailey highlighted, that it says that items must possess serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. And if they do, then they are accepted from this law. Now, every item in our collection, we believe, and think we can argue really strongly, does have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. But what does it mean to have serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors? I don't know. I think it probably means the same thing as what it means for it to have the value for adults, but we have certain items that our librarians have chosen to shelve in the adult section of the library because we think the content is more appropriate for adults. So what does that mean? We're not sure. And so we're not sure what it means about how we operate our library. The most important change for public libraries that this law brings about is that the library itself does not have the final say in what is in our collection. The way it works right now, both for our library and for every public library in the state of Idaho, is that we all have a process by which people can challenge items in our library. It's happened once since I've been on the library board here in Latah County. It doesn't happen very often for us. I mean, East Bonner County has had a lot of challenges, but all of us have a way that we can say, I don't think that this book belongs in a public collection. I don't think it has serious artistic, literary, scientific, or political relevance. And the librarian will respond to that, and then if the patron who is complaining still disagrees, then they can appeal it to the library board of trustees. And that's what I'm on. We're all elected, we represent our community, and we hear that appeal, and then we make a decision. And we make a decision either that it belongs or it doesn't belong. That's the way it is right now. What this law means is that if they don't agree, that same process will happen. The librarian will decide, and then it will go to the board of trustees. But if the person complaining is not willing to accept the board of trustees' decision, then it will then go, or they can take it to a court and sue us. And then the court has the final say. And in addition to a $250 penalty, whoever prevails is responsible for the other party's legal fees. So that could open us up to some really significant costs. I looked at there's always a fiscal statement put on every law that is passed. And the fiscal statement on this says there is no anticipated fiscal impact to the state or general fund because it requires no expenditure of state funds. Okay, that's true. There is no state tax money that is going to go into this process, but this is a huge cost to cities when it's the city library, or to counties when it's a county library, and to school districts. I was on that Zoom call and I was thinking, okay, 70 of us have just paid for a lawyer's consultation. And one of the takeaways from our conversation is that if we ever get a challenge, we have to start involving the lawyer right up front so that we can be building a case file. And so every time we get a challenge, it's going to be an additional legal cost. Even if we prevail, we're going to have much greater costs. So we're existing in a state of great uncertainty until that case law is established. And we're very hopeful that it is not Latah County Library District that is the one that is taken to court, but it could be. But we are talking about some things that we are going to do kind of proactively. One is that we're developing a new form that somebody has to fill out to challenge a book, and we're going to ask, what harm has a minor experienced from seeing this material, and some things like that. Another thing that we are expecting that we will need to have is that we will need to have challenge meetings where the library board of trustees sits like a court, and the person brings the challenge. And those meetings, of course, will be open to the public. And we are hopeful that members of the public who may disagree with challenges will be willing to show up and talk about what they see as the value of those books for minors. Every library is really struggling to figure out what this is going to mean. So what could it ultimately mean? Well, depending on what the court means, it could mean that we will need to close not allow minors into our library unless they are accompanied by a parent or guardian, which just hurts my soul. But there is a provision saying that if we can show that they were accompanied by an adult who signed something saying they could check it out, that it is an affirmative defense for us. So that is a possibility. Another possibility, right now, all of our library cards allow any library card holder to freely access any materials. We could institute a library card that is just for minors, where there are certain things that they can't check out. We're hopeful that we won't have to do any of those things. I did want to tell you about what one other library in Idaho has decided to do. The Preston Library announced that as of tomorrow, they are closing their buildings to any walking traffic for a month, for at least a month, maybe longer. And NPR quoted their librarian who said that there are a fair amount of books in the young adult section with LGBTQ+ themes or characters which need to be moved to the adult section because the law includes acts of homosexuality in its definition of sexual content harmful to minors. And then her name is Wheatley. Wheatley continued to say that the library will be reconfiguring its shelves so it is no longer possible to walk directly between its young adult section and its adult section. They will also position a staff member to monitor the adults only section and ensure no children are allowed to enter. So even if this were something that we wanted to do in Latah County, which is definitely not what we want to do, this would be totally unworkable. We have 6 branch libraries that are basically single room libraries. We are very leanly staffed. We are good stewards of the public money, and we wish we could hire more people, but we simply don't have space for more people. We don't have anybody who can monitor shelves or monitor the people coming in and out. So this law does present really great challenges to us. And as Mr. Bailey said, it is the result of legislative session after legislative session, these bills coming up and they're getting shot down. And finally this one got through, and we are all very tired. But I did want to mention that even though everyone is very tired, all of if you take the aggregate letters that went to legislators, they were very strongly against this law. If you look at the statements that happened in the hearings, they were very strongly against this law. If you look at the letters that went to Governor Little about this law, they were very strongly against this law. We have one local representative, Lori McCann, who spoke out against this law really boldly and did not vote for it. All of our other representatives did, very sadly. But that is kind of where we are. We are very hopeful that we will be able to keep the basic core values that we hold in our library, but this law may legally force us to change some of them. And that is my presentation, and
Todd, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Let's have questions. Suzanne.
Yeah, well, I realize that neither of you is a legislator or a lawyer, but my first impression is, what are the possibilities that this gets completely struck down because it's so, A, poorly written, stupidly legally argued, and it seems to me that it's impossible that it's become legislation without being challenged to be completely struck down because it's so odd.
I have no idea. My husband is a law professor and he's deeply distraught by it, but he doesn't think it's going to get struck down in its entirety. But I mean, I have no
What would
idea.
be, if it, does anybody here know, I mean, there's one lawyer among us I know, and you're a tax lawyer, so it doesn't count. But what are the possibilities, like what would the route be if one wanted to support it being struck down?
The purpose of this is not necessarily to put a law in effect that's going to carry through. This is a battle that has gone on since the writing of our Constitution, okay? And it's a battle that continues to go on. And Todd, I thank you for your history of how this ties back to the Heritage Foundation and things. That is very, very important, and we can go back beyond that. The purpose of this is to scare the hell out of people, as there's an attempt in place to change the worldview under which we live and accept that democracy is something that's good. And they're succeeding at it, and it's something that if we go back to the Koch brothers and the meetings that they called back before the 70s and into the 70s, which the Heritage Foundation and things came out of. A lot of very wealthy people went to some meetings that the Koch brothers set up. And they set up foundations, and their own foundations. They didn't do it as a group. They kept this stuff very, very secret. They decided that ultimately they were going to go and put their money into the states first, to take over the state control. And once they did that and could control the elections there and how things went and put the people, like, okay, it's not the popular view, even in Idaho, I don't believe, that this is the type of thing we want to live under. But they did it because they could control, put their money into, get the people elected that they wanted in there to be able to impose this authoritarian approach to how the world is supposed to look to us. And they're succeeding. We need to remember, vote, and we've got to start working very, very hard to get out the vote in Idaho and everywhere else. At the same time, this is going about to take and control what people have access to. Look at what's going on in Florida. They're rewriting your books for educating young kids. They want those kids to grow up not believing that history is what history is.
In answer to the question regarding the likelihood of it being struck down, one of the things that is very important for interested citizens to recognize is that the history of Supreme Court precedents regarding materials in public libraries and public schools is arguably in harmony with this legislation. That is to say, when cases like this have been brought up, you will find more precedents in favor of protecting the moral welfare, however that is concerned or defined, of students than you will libertarian points of view, which want to expand moral definitions. So if you look backward in terms of the Supreme Court precedents, you won't find much leverage there. However, you can argue, and you should, in letters to the editor and as publicly as possible, that this is a different kind of censorship than has been supported by people interested in the moral or other welfare of students. This kind of censorship in this legislation is known as viewpoint censorship. Viewpoint censorship is without any kind of precedent in American law. Viewpoint censorship means that if you have the wrong opinion, such as being homosexual, you cannot express that in public. That doesn't have precedent in American law. If you phrase this as a moral harm, you will find precedents there. But in terms of canceling points of view, if you argue the point on that level, now no supporter of 710 has anything to stand on. And that's essentially what it is. It's viewpoint censorship. The problem is no one is classifying it that way, and it takes a bit to inform lay people the difference about viewpoint censorship and how it contrasts with other forms of censorship put in place basically as a safeguard. Movie rating systems would be a good example of average censorship. You put a rating on something, or you put a label on something to prevent access by people who could harm themselves, etc. Right? That's an average form of censorship that we practice in the United States. Viewpoint censorship is precisely the kind which causes people hair to stand on end, because it is the form of censorship that is clearly un-American. And that's really what we have here.
Another question I have, does this have implications for university libraries?
Actually, somebody asked that on the Zoom call that I was on Friday, and we don't know. Because, minors do access university libraries, and our university library here is a public library. I mean, it's not technically a public library in library speak, but it is a library supported by public money. And so arguably that could be included in this.
And the other thing also to recognize for university minor relations is dual credit classes offered at the high school. As a result of the meeting last week, it was proposed that we end dual credit classes in the English department because we have people under the age of 18 who are legal minors who will be engaging with university level literature. And in consequence, because the credit is offered through the high school, and the high school is within the domain of this legislation directly, the dual credit class cannot really proceed because you're blending minors with adult literature.
Yeah, and on the Zoom call, there was also a question about the community cards, like have a community U of I card, and there are questions if minors could access adult material through community cards, so those could possibly go away too. But it's all based on what happens in the courts, so.
Stan and then Brent.
I'll try to find my bigger voice for you. As I've listened to all that you've told me, and thank you both for good presentations, well, I'm aware of that there are many questions you don't even know about because it's all so new, and therefore at that level, and even the ones you know about, you don't have the answers for. Am I right about that?
That's exactly right.
Okay, so my specific question, you addressed the issues of invisible books. that were disappearing? Will librarians find a statewide system wherein you can make the public aware of what those invisible books are, so that people can act appropriately to respond?
I can answer for the Latah County Library District. So we feel very committed to not changing anything until we need to, until we're kind of forced to by outcomes. So we are not removing books. We're not doing what Preston Library is. We're trying to change policies and set up forms and things so that we can deal with challenges. There is the issue of whether librarians will feel nervous about buying books. Our board has expressed that we don't want them to change how they're buying. So hopefully they will not feel that chill. So that's for our particular library.
Brent.
I'd like to follow up a little on Stan's comment, because he always has something worth thinking about. A thought experiment. Suppose I had enough money and enough technological prowess. Anytime a book was declared bad somehow, could be given to me, and I'll just publish it on my URL that I have to own. And any adults that want to allow their children to download it, fine and dandy. What's wrong with that? It sounds like a workaround, and it would cost some money and beyond my skills level, but
You're gonna have a lot of authors coming after you too.
yeah.
Well, Boston Public Library, San Diego Public Library, and Brooklyn Public Library all are, in response to book banning efforts around the country, offer teenagers free ebook cards.
Oh, they thought of it.
Yeah, and if there are challenges to books that, because of court cases, we have to make inaccessible to minors, we're not planning on getting rid of them. It's just that we will have to put them somewhere where minors cannot access them. And all of our meetings are open to the public. I mean, that's part of the sunshine laws, right? That we don't do things in the dark. So if anything happens that a book does have to be replaced, then there are public ways to know about it. And we hope people will be coming to our challenge meetings so you will know about it right up front. Of course, we mostly hope we don't have very many challenge meetings, but if we do, we hope that you will be coming. So
How will they be advertised, or how will we know about those challenge meetings?
we do publish them online. They have to be right now they're published in the newspaper, although the newspaper is getting published less and less. So, but they are published on our website.
Like
Anytime we have a public meeting, there are announcements. I think if you go to, okay, this is a good question to me, where it is on our website that they are published. If you want to give me your email afterward, then I will research exactly where it is. You'd find it on our website, but it is published on our website. And also you mentioned that you sometimes publish things, and I'm happy to make sure that we send a note to be published in your local, whatever your newsletter is.
Thursday's thoughts.
Yes, Thursday's thoughts.
I have another hypothetical question. It seems very foolish, but could you have a section called banned books where you very visibly display the books that have been banned in the local or surrounding libraries? They're not accessible, but that would give people the knowledge that, oh, here's a book I have to go online or somewhere else to find. So.
That's an intriguing idea. We've been trying to figure out what we're going to do if we do have to read books, and maybe a beautiful glass case would be a lovely idea.
Well, and then Stan says something about how can we let people know what these banned books are, like, this is happening in the rural libraries. You said people are silently taking books off of their shelves, and so maybe they could provide a list of the books that they've taken off their shelves, and something could be done with that.
Yeah. Yeah, the Latah County Rural Libraries are all part of our system, and so we do not have that happening. We're very committed to keeping things, but I think you were talking about surrounding us places, yeah.
Oh, but not in
So
Latah
other-
County, but in the state.
Yeah, we're talking about two different systems. So I represent the public library system and Mr. Bailey's representing the school system. So there are Latah County public school systems where that might be happening, I don't know, but not in the public system.
It would seem as though, there are libraries with governing boards that would be proactive in removing books, and boards that would be less proactive in removing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Linda, then Tim.
I keep wondering who decides what book is, should be banned. I mean, what's the criteria here for that?
So right now, do you mean, or is it when the law
Now
passes?
or in the future?
Yeah, so our librarians are the ones who pick the books, and we look for books that have literary, artistic, political, or scientific merit. And our particular librarians look at the reviews, like the national reviews. So for example, Kirkus School Library Journal, American Library Association award winners. For example, there's a Stonewall Award that's the best book about the LGBTQ plus experience, and we try to get those kinds of books, and those are often books that are banned. When there are challenges, and people don't agree with what the librarian has selected, then those come to the Board of Trustees, and we as the Board of Trustees listen to the arguments, and then we make a decision, and that's kind of the prevailing community standards is the idea, because we are elected, we show up on the ballot and you vote for us. But now the group that is, or person that is going to make that decision is either a judge or a jury. It's not clear if these are going to be cases judged by judges or by juries, but one of those two. So that's what it will be.
So there's no list of criteria that will help you make that decision?
Only what is in this, kind of the negative side of it, which is in this case of like what it shouldn't be this or this or this or this, but it should have artistic, literary, scientific, or political merit.
Because again, that's subjective.
Exactly, yeah.
Tim.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we were considering at one point, and I don't think we've gotten that far, of having banned books here on our library shelf.
You mean
And
at the church?
at the church, that's right. And then that way that people could, if they wanted to access it, they could. Of course, that doesn't mean that they'll stay on the shelf and they won't walk out and never come back. But we were thinking that it would be, so we know what it looks like. And not only that, if the other people want to come in, they want to know.
Todd, you were going to say something.
Well, one thing that is often also lost in the debate about what should be retained is this insistence that a book is only legitimate if it does possess literary, scientific, political, or scientific merit. And I think that that is awfully blind, because people don't just read to educate themselves. And in my classroom, I have established a shelf which is there precisely because every book on that shelf has been the subject of a very local challenge. I intend to provide those books on a essentially low-key checkout basis for interested students. Among the titles that I now have established, I have maybe 18 or 20 books on the shelf so far. And among those, I would count exactly 2 as being somehow escapist or non-serious. I feel just as passionately to support the existence of those books as I would any of the others on the same shelf. I think that a lot of students' anxiety, as multidimensional as it is, could be reduced by a more pleasant and casual reading experience. which is not necessarily dedicated, again, to education. Sometimes people read for pleasure, and sometimes that pleasure one would not like to communicate to one's parents. Fine. I have lots of kids in my classes who are paralyzed because they don't know how to navigate certain social situations, many of which are awkward to describe to others, and which they could probably learn a great deal about if they saw them demonstrated in fiction, much of which is not serious. So I think that there are definitely redeeming points about books which are sadly ignored by this legislation. And in our attempts to defend access to materials, we shouldn't leave out those books which have almost no redeeming value, except to pass time in a more pleasant way than you would have otherwise.
Kevin?
From my reading, I have the impression that the current overarching focus of the IFF is really just a big attack on public education in Idaho. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that historically that their goal is to end public education in Idaho.
That is the stated purpose of the CMP.
Can you comment on this law as one aspect of that attack?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So, the literature coming out of the Council for National Policy is very unapologetic, and they view this campaign in the context of a complete reorganization of education in the United States, under the assumption that public education is merely a tool for liberal indoctrination. That is their belief. And so, in consequence of that belief, they advocate, again, with zero apology, the replacement of public education with private and often parochial forms. And that's that. It's not complicated. That's exactly what they want.
I guess my thing that strikes me, it seems like you ought to interact with your lawyers and ask the question, couldn't we create a committee in the school district, it requires some volunteers, and likewise in the library, that would in fact be in charge of reviewing books in general, new books and books that in other places have been challenged, and say, we think this book should be here in the library, it should be available. So, like, get ahead of them and say, okay, we have a committee that is in charge of evaluating these, quote, standards from what this BS says, and we found these to be acceptable. So if anybody is gonna challenge that, right away, they're gonna be on the back foot, because there's already been a committee that's looked it over, and so very likely the school board and the library board would be very justified in saying, it's already been looked at.
Well, we've done exactly that.
Okay, great.
The problem is there are approximately 6 people on that committee, and there are tens and tens and tens of books to read. And so I have found it possible to read myself maybe 15 or so books this year, which is a tiny fragment of those that are actually in danger. And multiplying my efforts by 6 is still far too small. And the number who volunteered indicates the number of people who actually have even a marginal amount of time to dedicate to it. So you end up with just a resource scarcity. You're not wrong, like the idea is perfectly reasonable, but finding the people to do it and the time for them to do it in is virtually impossible.
It is an interesting idea, and I'll keep it in mind as we're talking about different strategies that we can have. I will point out that it is actually very similar to the Board of Trustees, which, I mean, we're a group of 5 people and we're supposed to represent community standards, but that doesn't mean there's not value in having a second layer. We rely a lot on our librarians. We have librarians who have Masters of Library Science degrees, and we do feel like they are equipped in a different way than a community member would be to understand what may be of value. And so I would definitely like not want to get rid of that layer, which I don't think you're suggesting, but it is an interesting idea to have another layer. It would be between the library and the board of trustees, so yeah.
And I was very thankful that you got out there and got your signs up on, or the people did, to let us know who was running and whose side they were on. Sometimes that's hard to pick out.
Well, you can ask
And
them.
we need more information because we know a group over here that would like to have all their people on your board.
Yeah.
And we need to know who's running for what and what they're behind.
We're approaching the end of the hour, so let's give each speaker a chance to give a closing comment.
Well, as we were talking about kind of action items, our library director just retired last week, and we are interviewing this week and next week library directors, and there is a public meeting. The first candidate is coming this Wednesday at 10 o'clock to the library to give a presentation, and the next candidate a week from Friday at the same time. And we would love to have ways to show these candidates that we have a community that values freedom of information and is not in favor of book banning. So if you're available to come, you are welcome to come this Wednesday or a week from Friday.
Where is it held?
In the library, in the break room,
What time?
10 o'clock in the morning, both days.
And again, letting us know when you're going to have voting, because if you're the only thing that's being voted on, I gotta get out there and get my sign up.
Okay, Todd, you're.
Voting is important. It is uncommon. However, it's not a frequent thing that we do. I think that it is more productive to do some research on an individual basis so that you are capable of lending that research to NPR, to other mouthpieces that might be able to make some of the intricacies of this controversy more obvious. And if news organizations actually heard from more than just a handful of people about what's actually going on, I think we would find better coverage, and with that, a much more vocal opposition.
Thank you.